God shows Abram, as he shows us, that he has decided as God that he will give the gift of righteousness, the gift of a not guilty verdict, to those who take him at his word, who believe his promises, who accept them by faith.
Welcome to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths. We continue our message today, the Lord, our shield and reward. And Jonathan, so great to look back even to the early chapters of the Old Testament and see that it is God himself who says, no, I want relationship with you, and I'm making a way for that to happen.
It is such a heartening and even a thrilling thing to see as we dive into the stories of the Bible, and in particular today, the story of Abram, to see how God does desire that and pursues that covenant relationship with him. And one of the things that God is teaching him throughout the story is that ultimately the great prize that this man will have in his life is not the lands that the Lord will give him, or even the offspring and the nation that will come from him, but it is knowing the Lord. It is the Lord himself who is the great prize, the great reward, who is his shield for this life and for the next. And that's something that we need to learn as we study the scriptures, and I think we need to learn experientially as well in our own lives.
We certainly do, and so let's open our copy of the Scriptures to the book of Genesis. We're in chapter 15 as we continue a message called The Lord, Our Shield and Reward. Here is Jonathan.
I think it's actually well worth our time to take a few moments and go out and look at the night sky and the stars that fill the heavens. And it's worth taking time to praise God, isn't it? And to thank God that his promise will not fail, that his family of redeemed children will continue to grow beyond all counting, despite all the obstacles along the way. For the fearful believer, God brings the help of a powerful visual aid. Next, he brings the gift of righteousness. There are occasions where a brief statement is put so simply and in such an unadorned way that we could almost overlook its weight and its significance. One survivor of the Holocaust describes the experience of an American tank driving through the gates of the concentration camp where he was being held and was soon to be killed, and the American soldiers from the tank simply shouting out, "You're free. You're free." Two simple words, but bearing all the weight in the world, full of such joyful hope. And you can imagine the prisoners, can't you? You can imagine the prisoners wondering, did I mishear that? Did I hear it right? Did I get that right? Did they really say that? Did they mean it? Is it true? Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6 is one of the weightiest verses in all the Bible, and it is one of the most hope-filled. It is a profound statement of the basic principle underlying the gospel. It points forward to the work of Christ and the key divine mechanism of our salvation. It is foundational to New Testament gospel faith. But it is put so simply, isn't it? We could read the chapter and skim over it so very easily. God has just reaffirmed his promise to give Abram a great family of descendants. He made that promise in the face of Abram's fearful doubts, as we see. And in response to the promise of God, here is what we read, verse 6, "And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness." Now, to be righteous is simply to be right with God. It is for God the judge, and he is the judge. It is for God the judge to declare that you are innocent, that all is well with you in his divine courtroom. Now, if we've been reading the story carefully, we know full well that Abram was not someone who had a perfectly righteous record before God. Far from it. He was not innocent on the basis of his behavior. We only need to look back to chapter 13 to see a major moral lapse in the life of Abram. We only need to look forward to chapter 16 to see another one coming. And as we zoom out from Abram and his story within the scriptures, we see very quickly and very clearly that actually no one has a perfect moral record. No one has their own righteousness. That's the heart of the human problem. ever since Adam and Eve rebelled against God in the Garden of Eden, the problem of unrighteousness, the problem of human guilt before God, it is the fundamental human problem. That's why suffering and death have come into the world. Those things are the judgment of God for our failure to live as He created us to live. But you'll remember, God has set Abram apart. He's promised to bring salvation, blessings to him and to his family, and through them to the nations of the world. And if we think carefully about that promise back in Genesis 12, about the great promise that was given, we have to ask the question, if we're thinking carefully about it, we have to ask, what about the problem of sin? What about human rebellion? What about the fact of humanity's guilt before God? How will salvation blessings come when the problem of sin remains? Well, here in verse 6 of chapter 15, in the scope of just a dozen or so words in English, we get to the heart of the answer of that question, an answer that the rest of the Bible will unpack for us. Abram is given a reaffirmation of the promise of God. He is called upon to believe, to trust what God says. And we read verse 6, and he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Now, the default assumption of the human heart is always to believe that if there is a God and I'm going to meet him at the end of my life, he will either accept me or reject me, bless me or curse me on the basis of the things that I have done, on the way in which I have lived my life. I think that's what most people tend to assume. But look what God the judge does here with Abram. It's so remarkable, it's so striking, it's so surprising. He looks on Abram's faith-filled response to his word, faltering and fearful as it may be, and he counts that faith to Abram as righteousness. He reckons it to him. It's wonderful to have credit added to your account. Maybe you've had that experience with a company of some kind that you deal with. You know, you go to the Starbucks drive-thru and you order a coffee, and you get 10 minutes down the road and you take your first sip and you realize that it's all wrong. They gave you some green tea latte or something strange when you just wanted a normal coffee. So you know, it's too far now to turn back. So later in the day, you call customer service and you tell them of your very traumatic experience that morning. And they say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that, sir." "No problem at all, sir. We're going to credit $20 to your account as a gesture of our goodwill." And you look on your Starbucks app and you have a credit to your account, one you didn't anticipate, and it just makes your day. As Abram believes his word, God the judge decides to credit to Abram's spiritual and judicial account a full measure, an account full of perfect righteousness. Now, it's very important for us to see here and register here that God is not saying, you know, "Abram, you have done such an amazing thing here in believing my promise. I am so impressed that you are taking me at my word. I want you to know that this is so impressive that it cancels out all the wrong things you have ever done, and it makes you fit and ready for heaven. You've earned it, pal." That's not what he's saying. This declaration, this transfer, it is not achieved by Abram's faith as an act of merit or an act of personal exertion. We must not read this and think that Abram earned the righteousness that he received in verse 6. Now, there's no perfect analogy here, but that line of thought would be equivalent to something like this. Just see what you make of this. You walk into your bank, your local branch, to do a bit of banking. As you enter, one of the staff asks if you would mind participating in a customer service survey, give a little bit of feedback on them and a bank and as an organization and so on. And once you've answered their small handful of questions, they inform you that as a thank you for your kindness in taking part in this survey, they are canceling the balance of your mortgage. $100,000, $200,000, $500,000, whatever it is, canceled, wiped clean, just to thank you for your gracious participation today. Now, that would be really nice for sure, but it would also be entirely ridiculous. There's no equivalency there. And the same is true here. Abram's belief does not buy him a not guilty verdict. That's not the lesson. That's not the point here. The point rather is this: God shows Abram, as he shows us, that he has decided as God that he will give the gift of righteousness, the gift of a not guilty verdict before God the judge. He will give that gift to those who take him at his word, who believe his promises, who accept them by faith. That's the principle that we're learning here. That is how God's salvation blessings will come. We don't know all the details yet. We don't actually know the account from which this great store of righteousness will be drawn, at least not yet in this point in the Bible story. But the principle is here in Genesis 15:6, and it is a breathtaking principle. God will not save us on the basis of our good works or our own moral record, and of course we would never be saved if that was the way in which he operated. No, God is the God who counts righteousness to unrighteous people who simply take him at his word, who simply have faith. The Apostle Paul devotes more or less an entire chapter of his great letter to the Romans on this particular verse here in Genesis 15. If we had time to work through Romans chapter 4 together, I'd love to do that. We don't have that time today. But Paul sees this key verse in Genesis, and he sees that it teaches us that our salvation comes as a gift, not as a payment for good works. He sees that this verse points forward to Jesus and speaks to us directly as gospel people. And this is how Paul finishes his discussion in Romans 4 and verse 23. But the words "it was counted to him," words from Genesis 15, but the words "it was counted to him" were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It will be counted to us who believe in him who raised from the dead Jesus our Lord, who was delivered up for our trespasses and raised for our justification. Those words were written for us, says Paul. They were written for us to teach us that righteousness is counted to us as we believe in the God who gave his Son for our sin and who raised him from the grave for our justification. Now, friends, this is really the heart of everything. This is the fundamental principle of the faith. This is the core of the gospel. And I want to pause on it for a second here. I want to emphasize it because it's so important. I want to emphasize it in case there are any listening today who think that they don't need what Abram needed here, who don't need the gift of righteousness. And maybe that is you today. You just don't have a sense of spiritual needs, a sense of guilt before God. Please notice this with me. Notice verse 6 again. Great Abram, father of the nation of Israel, hero of the faith, he needed God to credit to him a righteousness that was not his own. He needed forgiveness. He needed to be made right with God because he wasn't. And friends, that is your fundamental need. And that is mine as well. It is the fundamental human need. I wonder if you see your need today. Others may, of course, be at the other end of the spectrum, and actually your burden is that you know full well that you haven't met God's requirements, you have not lived up to his standards, and you are laboring under a sense of obligation to do anything and everything you can to make yourself right before God, to earn his favor. And if that's you, if you are laboring under that burden, let me urge you to stop laboring. Let me urge you instead to notice verse 6. Ours is the God who credits righteousness to the unrighteous, who gives it as a gift to those who will believe. So let me ask you today, have you received that gift? And by faith, have you made it your own? And if you have received it, will you rest today in the security and the peace of that gift, knowing that God the judge counts you as righteous in his sight?
You're listening to Encounter the Truth with Jonathan Griffiths. Our message is called The Lord, Our Shield and Reward, and we've been taking a look at what the Lord brings to the fearful believer. We're going to get back to this message from Genesis 15 in just a moment. If you ever miss a broadcast, come to the website, listen online. It's encounterthetruth.org. That's encounterthetruth.org. You know, Encounter the Truth is a listener-supported program, and as you give a gift of any amount this month, we want to say thank you by sending you a book called Everything a Child Should Know About God. It's a book Jonathan used with his own kids Hope you'll stay tuned. We'll tell you a little bit more about that and how you can get your own copy a little bit later in the broadcast. But right now, we're going to get back to the message. Again, we're in Genesis 15. Here is Jonathan.
To the fearful believer, God gives the gift of righteousness. And finally, to the fearful believer, he gives the security of the covenant. At this point in the narrative, God is clearly seeking to provide assurance to Abram. There's no doubt about that. Abram is still actually fearful and rather shaky, even if he is showing faith. God reminds him that he is the God who has shown deliverance and who will yet show deliverance and faithfulness in the future. Verse 7, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. That's a pretty steadying reminder of who God is and what he yet intends to do. But Abram is still shaky, verse 8. But he said, "Oh Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Where's the evidence? Where's the proof? I feel I need that." It frankly feels a little shocking for this man of faith to be pressing God like this, but God, in his grace, he doesn't turn a deaf ear to his request. Rather, he turns now to give him a very profound assurance. Now, I think we all appreciate the value of a contract, a binding agreement to seal the terms of an important relationship, whether it be a personal relationship, a corporate relationship, or a diplomatic relationship. Throughout much of human history, nations have related to one another on the basis of formal treaties. I recently saw some famous historical footage. I don't think I'd seen it before, but footage showing the signing of the agreement between Germany and the Allied forces that brought the Second World War to a conclusion. In a sense, the whole world was holding its breath as the ink soaked into the paper on that day. In the ancient world of Abram's day, important agreements were sealed and established in ceremonies that had parallels to the one we see here in the next few verses. On the face of it, all of this looks rather strange to our eyes. God calls upon Abram, verse 9, to bring him a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. The animals, except the birds, they're then cut in two and separated. The scene is now set for a covenant ceremony of a type that was evidently known in the ancient world. The two parties entering into the covenant would be expected to walk between the pieces of slain animals, and the implication, the symbolism would simply be this: if either party breaks the terms of the covenant, of the contract, then that party will accept the fate of these animals for themselves. We recognize entering into this thing that the penalty for breach of covenant is death, and so our very lives are on the line for this thing. Today, you and I get just a little glimmer of this. We don't have covenants like that, but we get just a glimmer of this when we sign perhaps a mortgage or a lease agreement. If you read through the fine print, and that's a fearful and exhausting thing to do, but if you read through the fine print, you know that the penalties you are risking in entering into this contract, they are huge. Your entire financial future is on the line. If you don't make your payments, you're going to lose your home. If you back out of the agreement early, you will face penalties of crippling sums of money. Well, here in this type of covenant, the very lives of the two parties are on the line. That seems to be the symbolic meaning of the animals. But how things proceed from here is far from normal. As the sun sets on this rather dramatic scene, one of the two parties in the covenant falls into a deep sleep. Verse 12, and a dreadful and great darkness falls upon him. This hardly looks as though it's going to be anything of an equal partnership. One signatory to the covenant is now out for the count. If you or I did that in the bank manager's office when we were in signing for a mortgage as the terms were being explained, we just sort of dozed off with our head on the desk. The bank manager might gingerly remove the papers from before us and pop them into the shredder, knowing that this client is probably not a very good risk. As Abram sleeps, the Lord then speaks to him, promising him actually both trouble and triumph in the years ahead. And now the scene only gets more dramatic and only becomes more strange. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. On more than one occasion in Scripture, a fire is a physical manifestation of the presence of God. And what Abram is being shown here is that God's own presence is passing between these rows of slaughtered animals. While Abram lies in a daze from his deep sleep, God himself enters into the covenant obligation. And as he does so, he reaffirms his covenant commitment to give this land to Abram and his family. Well, what is all this telling Abram, and what is all this teaching us? The symbolism, it is as powerful as it is profound. God has entered into a covenant with his chosen people, but in entering into this covenant, God is taking upon himself the cost and the responsibility of the covenant. He is saying, if this covenant is broken, he will bear the risk and even the penalty. Friends, the Old Testament is full of vivid pictures that point us forward to the cross of Calvary. They're to be found all over the place, and we see that time and time again. But this, I think, is one of the most wonderful. God himself, he is committing to pay the cost, even the cost of death itself, should the covenant be broken. God himself, he is the God of faithfulness. He's never going to break this covenant. That's not within his nature. But Abram and his children, his physical children and his spiritual children, we're not given to faithfulness in and of ourselves. The people of God, the scriptures will tell us and experience will show us, the people of God are going to fail again and again and again to meet the requirements of the covenant and to live in faithfulness to the God of the covenant. And the breakage clause, the penalties for infraction, the curse of death itself, who's going to bear it? Well, it's not going to be Abram. And it's not going to be his people. It's not going to be me, and it's not going to be you. God himself, in the person of his Son, he's going to bear it. And he's going to pay it. As the divine presence passed between those slain animal parts, there is a foreshadowing, isn't there? There is a foreshadowing of another journey that God himself is going to take. The journey of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, as he carries his cross even to Calvary and dies that the people of the covenant may live. When we find ourselves wondering whether God is going to come through for us, whether he is going to keep his promises to do us good, here is the deepest and the most profound comfort and reassurance. It is the image of God taking the walk of the covenant on his own. Walking between these slain animal parts in Genesis 15, walking to the hill of Calvary. Hundreds of years later, for those of fearful faith, the greatest comfort of all is the comfort that God himself has taken upon himself the full cost of the covenant, that we might be secure within that covenant despite all our sin and our failure and our sheer unworthiness. And friends, in those seasons of fear, and we have seasons of fear, don't we? In those seasons of fear, we must look to Calvary. When things look most bleak and it seems as though God might not come through and might abandon us at the last, when we feel like that in our darker moments of fear, we look to the one who gave his life to make and to keep his covenant with us. And as we look to him, taking the walk of the covenant, we know that the one who did such a thing cannot fail us, will never fail us in all the days that are to come. And for the fearful believer, that is our assurance and that is our comfort.
Jonathan Griffiths wrapping up our message, The Lord, Our Shield and Reward, as we've been taking a look at Genesis 15 and seeing what the Lord brings to the fearful believer. Well, we're able to bring you Encounter the Truth each day because of your generosity. So we want to say thank you for giving a gift this month by sending you a book that Jonathan used with his own kids. It's called Everything a Child Should Know About God, and it's our thank you gift to you for your financial support. Find out more or give online when you come to encounterthetruth.org or call us at 833-99-TRUTH. That's 833-998-7884 or encounterthetruth.org. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us next time.